So, John, have you been in Iowa at all?
I have been to Iowa, my friend.
All right. Well, what's happening there?
I've been to Cedar Falls, baby.
Well, I appreciate that. I think it's spelled differently, but I'll still take part ownership of that. We are now I don't know, you could almost count it in hours until the Iowa caucus. You are a longtime observer of Iowa caucuses. Have you over the years been able to sort of gauge, to get a sense of what's actually going on the ground, or is it too tricky?
No, I don't think it's too tricky, but you do have to be on the ground. The big danger with the Iowa caucuses is that people look at polls, or they kind of look from afar at, what reports they get. And it does require you to physically be there, and I'll tell you why. The Iowa caucuses are small, not big. The actual turnout of eligible voters for the Iowa caucuses is a relatively tiny portion of the overall electorate there. And so as a result, going to rallies, going to events, going to forums there gives you a really good measure of things because, if 1,000 people show up in, Storm Lake or 500 show up in Cedar Rapids, that's a measurable portion of the people that will go to the caucuses in that place. And so you want to go out and see who's got the energy. You want to look at the grassroots efforts there, which are by and large far more important than the TV advertising. But yeah, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but yeah, you can get a flavor of it. And you know what the number one question you ask people of, really, especially people backing some of the lesser known candidates, it's who's your second choice?
Right.
Because in the caucuses, if you come in for a candidate and they don't get 15% support, you're going to end up caucusing for somebody other than the person whose campaign pin you're wearing. And so once you know a few of those dynamics, you can cover them and, get at least some feel.
Okay. So give us a sense of what your feel is. I mean, does it end up dovetailing with what you're seeing in terms of polling? Is it because of that dynamic, do polls really tell the full story? Tease this out for us. It's so much more, it seems, complicated than obviously just a primary, right? People go and they vote. They vote for
different. Yeah.
So, all right. So give us a sense of if your experience on the ground there this time around seems to coincide with the polling.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it basically does coincide with the polls, but the polls are sort of a starting point for hopefully a deeper analysis. The polls right now show, by and large, not all of them, but overall, show a Bernie Sanders surge. And it's quite significant. If you kind of look at the quality polls, the polls that interview a lot of people, seem to have a good reputation on the ground. In the fall, they showed... at a certain point, they showed Elizabeth Warren really rising, Biden kind of holding strength. Then you had a Buttigieg surge. There's no question of that, and he went way up at a certain point. But since the start of the year, since about the first week or so in the year, you have seen a steady pattern of increase for Bernie Sanders in the polling. The Des Moines Register poll had him a little bit ahead. Now we've seen New York Times and Emerson polls that put him way ahead. And I think that's credible from what I see on the ground. When I've been out there, and I was just out there over the weekend, when I'm at events, it's just amazing. The Sanders events are huge. They have incredibly high energy. They do have a lot of people who look like traditional Iowa caucus goers, but they have a heck of a lot of people who don't look like traditional Iowa caucus goers, younger folks, and just a diversity of folks that kind of expands it out. And so I always look at that as a baseline. But then the interesting thing is that when you go to the Sanders events, once the event is done, if you linger around for 15 minutes, you will see a huge portion of the people who were at the event, who came for the theater, if you will, for Michael Moore speaking, for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for the band Portugal the Man playing, and then for Sanders himself speaking. If you stick around after, what's fascinating is you see a lot of people, hundreds of people, doing training to go caucus and to go to the doors. So they're not just having events, they're actually structurally doing the sort of organizing you need to do. So my sense is Sanders has the lead that the polls is showing is credible and real at this point. And then the one other thing I would throw into the mix is that I think that Buttigieg, who has done well in the polls in Iowa and continues to poll at a reasonably strong point, he also has something going on. When I've seen his events, there's clearly, there's good crowds there. When you talk to the people, Buttigieg seems to be attracting a lot of traditional Iowa caucus goers, i.e. the people who go every 4 years no matter what. A lot of them seem to like him. And so my sense is that he also is someone who's in a position to finish pretty well.
That's interesting. And so if I understand what you're saying, and I've read something to this effect, that Sanders basically bootstrapped these rallies and was sort of has an apparatus that is taking advantage of the live events, I guess, to sort of exponentially grow his organization. Is there any indication that other campaigns are doing something exactly like that, similar to that?
Yeah, they're all trying to do that, Sam. And it's just a matter of how many people you sort of have enthusiastically sticking around doing it. Look, the Biden campaign clearly wants to do that, but the Biden events tend to be smaller. I think you have a little less of that. But even, I will tell you, there was a Biden event, a week or so ago, a couple of weeks now, I guess, where former Secretary of State John Kerry was literally sitting with people, getting them to sign their caucus cards, i.e. to, commit to caucus and check on their location and that. So all the campaigns do this. I'm just saying that it looks to me like the Sanders campaign is far more systematic, and that it goes sort of deeper with it. They are getting the people to commit to caucus, but they are also working very, very hard on getting the people to talk to their neighbors, to draw neighbors. Don't just go to the caucus alone, go with a carload of people. And that sort of thing historically is very valuable. The other thing that the Sanders people are doing that's interesting is they are extremely generous and extremely kind to supporters of Andrew Yang and the small group of people who are supporters of Tom Steyer, and supporters of people who are sympathetic to Elizabeth Warren and others. They clearly understand that at the caucus, when you're in that room, because each candidate is trying to maximize their level of support, you got to have 15% of the people in the room to begin to get your support registered for the purposes of ultimately getting delegates. And they're clearly looking very, very hard and very, very, in a very sophisticated way, I think, at how to get as many of those other people in the room over to their corner. And on caucus night, that can really exponentially improve your position.
You were giving us a sense of both sort of what you have experienced over the years in reporting on what's going on in Iowa, and specifically on how the campaigns are taking advantage and have been taking advantage since, I guess probably 6 to 12 months they've been doing this, holding rallies, using those as a mechanism in which to build a volunteer force. You told us that Sanders seems to have an operation that is the most well-oiled in this regard and optimizing it the most. And to a large extent, right, this is more than the other campaigns. All campaigns have a ground game, but it seems that the theory of the case for the Sanders campaign is that they are going to bring low propensity voters, low propensity caucusers, I guess, in this instance, into the mix in a way that other campaigns can't, don't look to do in the same way. And that this is really going to be not only the formula for them winning Iowa, but the formula for them winning the primary and, to a certain extent, their governance, their governing formula as well. What's your sense about that? I mean, do we have, can we tell at this point, like X percentage of Sanders caucus goers maybe doing it for the first time?
No, we don't know that. We won't know till caucus night. But on caucus night, you will, because there's a lot of, frankly, there's a weird kind of exit polling on caucuses where you do ask people if it's their first caucus, stuff like that. It's not as sophisticated as you might want to get, but you can get a good feel. You'll also, frankly, you can get a good feel going into the room. Remember, you can be in the room where a caucus occurs. And if there's a lot of 21-year-olds there, right. These are people who haven't caucused before. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that. The other thing, though, that I would put in the mix is I do think, all this structural stuff, all this strategic grassroots stuff is vital. There's another element of it, and I know we're going to talk about some endorsements in a second, but I'll throw one other thing on that I think has benefited Sanders, and I wrote about it for The Nation this week. He came out really strongly against war with Iran. In fact, I would go so far as to say he took a pretty militant stance, along with Ro Khanna, saying, no funds for a war with Iran, no support for it. We just don't want it. Now, to some extent, that tension has dialed down as regards Iran, and we know that. But in Iowa, which is a state that has, especially in the Democratic Party there, a really strong anti-war base, I think that solidified and shored up a substantial amount of his support from older folks and from more traditional caucus goers. And so I think he's got this combination of a very strong organization and, frankly, a message that, while not uniquely powerful in Iowa, has a particular resonance there. And when I was interviewing people out there, I was surprised by how many, when I said, why are you back at Sanders, brought up war and peace issues first.
That's fascinating, because I think that's clearly Sanders. I mean, the people can argue about the specifics of the proposals of legislation on Medicare for all between Warren and Sanders, and I think there's some difference there without a doubt. But the most substantial and the sort of almost like the prima facie difference between Bernie Sanders and the rest of the field is in foreign policy. And you and I are people who I think, generally feel that foreign policy, just by observation, foreign policy is usually not at the forefront at a time where we're not involved in a war, or at least, right. A massive war. We've got these forever wars that are going on, but they're low grade. People walking around don't even talk about them, in any. But I wonder if Donald Trump, in his facing the world and the sort of raising the specter of World War III at any time, because he's like, why can't we just nuke them? Or we're going to nuke Iran or whatever it is. I wonder if that has heightened the sensitivities, at the very least, of the Democratic voters.
I think it has. And again, I had a sense of this. Congressman Ro Khanna, who I've interviewed many times, had said to me, he felt it in Iowa. He felt like in the second week of January, after Sanders had come out very militantly against going to war and really incorporated into his speeches, Ro Khanna told me that when he was going to events, people were just bringing it up on a regular basis. So when I went out there this last weekend, I asked a lot of folks, I just said, what's driving you? What's in your heart? What's kind of the thing that's really, and like the first person I asked was a county supervisor in Black Hawk County, Iowa. That's the Waterloo area. And he said, oh, this whole war thing, you know what I mean? And he was very passionate about it. Now, he's a Sanders backer, no doubt about it. But I just want to emphasize, I think this is an undercovered part of the dynamic. And again, Iowa has a long history of rewarding candidates who have the more anti-war stance. It doesn't mean they always win. But just remember that in 2007, when he went out to Iowa as, kind of an upstart candidate, Barack Obama, in every speech, or at least in a lot of his speeches, made a real point of saying, he had opposed the war in Iraq. And it was one of the things that distinguished him from Hillary Clinton back then. And I met a lot of people in 2008 who said they were caucusing for Obama because of that. So I do think Sanders has got a little something going there.
Interesting. All right. Well, we got about a minute and a half left. Not as much as I wanted, but this has been fascinating. So just tell me, what do you think the implications are of the endorsement that Elizabeth Warren got? I just noticed today the New York Times, even amongst their own readers, the New York Times endorsement doesn't seem to hold that much weight. Maybe it was because they endorsed two people. Not the case with the Iowa Register. What are the implications of that?
Well, that's exactly the right question. Look, the New York Times endorsement was an incredibly poorly thought, badly done endorsement. You don't endorse two people at a point where folks are trying to sort it out. And frankly, there was conflicting messages in it. I just don't think it was effective. The Des Moines Register was the opposite. The Des Moines Register, which had interviewed all these candidates, came out very, very strongly for Warren, and they made a really smart argument. Their argument was, she's not radical. There's nothing extreme about what she's saying. She is proposing the right solutions for this time. And remember, this is the Des Moines Register, which is not as enthusiastic about Sanders. They argued she's somebody who has more of a skill with governance, right? And so they make this argument for her that was, I guess, for lack of a better term, a very sort of FDR argument, that she's a little bit, in this tradition of somebody who, if they get elected, actually will know how to do some great big things with government. Now, you can disagree with that. I disagreed with some elements of their editorial. That's not my point. My point is it was effectively argued and very, very good at it. Obviously, the Warren people are going to use it a lot, but I also think that Warren should take it to heart. I mean, I think they've in many ways framed out a good argument for her. And what's going to be interesting is I think at this point, a lot of the Sanders people are locked in. So Warren's challenge is to draw people away from Buttigieg and from Klobuchar and from, some of these other folks. And that editorial, I think the Des Moines Register folks are very savvy. I think they wrote that editorial with that in mind.
Interesting.
It may well help Elizabeth Warren.
Well, I guess we will find out in a couple of days. John Nichols from The Nation magazine, always a pleasure.